And let's do it, ladies and gentlemen. The sole bane, perhaps the biggest hindrance to Chris's entire character. It goes far beyond laziness. It goes so far beyond narcissism because it is something that Chris can simply not see past. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Chris and his ego, his hubris, his swift and terrible sword, the very thing that has been the downfall for many, many great people. But many great people in their time have flown too close to the sun. Chris merely looked at it and then retreated back to his pit and considered himself better because he did not succumb to crashing back down to earth. As it turns out, you don't need to fly up to altitude to have a crash. And what is the crash, guys? Well, firstly, you wish you were me. Now, I would say that just about sums it up. I could have literally ended this video right now and say, there you are, guys. I mean, what else do you need? Because let's think about this. Chris said that when he was, he was still 27 when he said this. This is when Chris went through pretty much an entire year theoretically going to hell and back. Blue Sky, Ivy, Liquid Chris. All of these things, well, among many others, happened in 2009. And considering that Chris did not come out of it looking particularly very clever, but Chris persisted and continued anyway. And yet, despite all of this, are you really trying? I think people would have gone on so much better with their lives if they were not on the receiving end of the sort of trolling that Chris had been under. And yet, what you're about to see throughout all of this is that kind of what I made in previous videos where I talked about Chris and remorse and negligence and stuff like that. Chris, and you're prepared to hear this a couple of times in this video, Chris didn't exactly do much to redeem himself, because in some strange roundabout way, Chris probably thought and continues to feel to this day that he didn't do anything wrong whatsoever and he was always the victim. Sometimes it can be difficult, don't get me wrong, to actually turn the finger inwards and say, yes, it was my fault. But Chris doesn't even do that because, as I've mentioned before, Chris is a very reactionary sort of person. He is someone who acts almost on impulse, aka somebody who thinks with their who acts and thinks with their heart as opposed to their brain. They don't ever stop to pause and think about what they are doing. They will just do what they feel is the right thing to do, as opposed to doing what is the right thing to do. And in case you're thinking, Chris is because I know there's probably going to be some people out there saying that Chris actually has the cognitive dissonance to understand when to start and stop and stuff like that. However, you don't need to be in your late 20s to come to that conclusion. You don't even really need to be in your early. People learn this sort of thing before they even get to the age of 10. Although that could also be brought about by Chris's, education, and rather the fact that Chris was not put into specific schools because of his parents. Now, because we'll be getting into that very shortly about how much of this is his parents' fault, or I hesitate to say the word fault, and I rather say how much of this is his parents' responsibility, because, regardless, you have to do what is the right thing to do as well. And that means probably, it's not something that they were, I couldn't imagine Bob, they were just, they sat and the head of Nathaniel Green Elementary saying, right, Chris is probably going to need a lot more support and probably a lot more resources than we can have here. You've got 10 seconds to say yes or no. They would not have pressured Chris's parents like that. But with that being said, let's get to it. With the very next quote, well, pride is not a sin. For one needs some self-esteem and confidence to motivate themselves and inspire others with soul and heart. Well, you see, it's not that Chris it's not that Chris is wrong for saying this. The problem with this, however, is the fact that, well, Chris has always had this annoying habit of speaking as a holier-than-thou figure. And some would say, fair enough, or who says we don't get a little bit preachy here and there, but you would be half expecting Chris to actually put his words into action. And, well, more often than not, Chris doesn't. Sometimes it is better literally just not to say anything, for better and for worse. By the way, I should point out this is from CPU Blueheart. It's Chris, so that's why I'm saying Chris and not Blueheart. Distinguishing pride from arrogance, ignoring that pride can both have a positive and negative connotation. Egotism is the most important and self-destructive of Chris's flaws. It is this egotism that one day may lead to someone playing Kick the Autistic in real life. And as we see this sort of artistic rendition, including how did Chris, the way Chris manages to shit himself, of course this is just something that's just there. I mean, why wouldn't it be at this point? But let's get to it. Also, you have this, Chris stroking his own ego by having two of Ben Saint's characters admire him. And by the way, you'll notice too, Ben Saint's characters praising and admiring Chris, and Chris not actually saying anything nice to them back. Or at least in this panel. Maybe he did it in a different panel, but it's the fact that they do it first, and, well, Chris doesn't do it first. Meanwhile, the origins. When you don't have people in your life pushing you, can you push yourself? Tori Amos. Raspberry Swirl. I'm not entirely sure what that is. Why is Chris such an egotist? In his sheltered childhood, his enabling parents taught him to shift blame for all of his troubles to other people. A sense of entitlement, again homegrown, skewed his perception of the proportionality between his problems and those of other people. Chris doesn't completely lack empathy. Sometimes. He isn't a psychopath. Debatable. But the internal scale by which he weighs the importance of himself against that of others tilts far in his favour. The problem was compounded by his autism, making it difficult for him to understand social cues and relate normally to his peers. Quite simply, he grew up in a different world. And when we say different world, we're not talking different world as in the 1980s. We're talking different world as in the sort of world that even at a young age you should have been like sort of invested a lot more, or at least in a certain way, with the world around you. Now, when I say certain way and stuff like that, well, it could be anything between spending a lot of your free time reading, or going out and playing with your friends and stuff like that. Whether Chris did anything beyond playing video games and not interacting with the outside world. Whether you are in school or out of school, it's something like that is going to catch up to you when you realize that it's not going to pay your bills unless you want to make it work in your favor, which Chris sort of is doing, but it's probably nowhere near sustainable enough. Oh, and by the way, yes, this comic panel of, well, Chris saying, never mess with a truly frustrated virgin when he is on a quest for a girlfriend to share true love and trust with. So, apparently, it's more than perfectly okay for Chris to do, things like loiter and hold attraction signs and nearly trip people up with a red string of fate, because because Chris's needs are apparently more important than others. That's the logic Chris decides to go with. And, well, and to be honest, the way Chris draws himself at the dish is the only thing this spoon-looking ass is ever going to get. But that explains why Chris was an egotist, struggled with egotism, or has tendencies towards egotism. While Chris's childhood was less than ideal, it shouldn't have been quite so crippling. Time and experience have helped, should have tempered his ego, and his half-brother supposedly suffered far worse and still managed to make something of himself. His parental half-siblings managed to acquire doctorate degrees, becoming an eye doctor and a math expert respectively. They were able to develop and learn from the past. And yes, guys, listen, it's a really important thing to stress this, and to, well, not stress, emphasize, is that there are plenty of people who make something of their lives who come from, maybe less than ideal backgrounds or home life. Disasters, neglective or abusive parenting. Some people just take it upon themselves to realize exactly who they are and what they want out of it. Some people are not, it's not necessarily that they're not as driven as other people, it's just they know what they want, and they know sort of that they can do it without being overtly aggressive in their approach. And it's such a confusing little thing to start rambling on about, because the problem we have, and when it comes to Chris compared to his half siblings, is that, well, they were considerably older than Chris anyway. And even though age really doesn't have much else to do with this, but you gotta wonder what Bob and Bob's, how they thought they could go about raising yet another child, because by that point they were quite elderly. And, well, Chris turned out to be quite different, probably more than Bob and Bob could initially anticipate or even care to admit, that it was quite hard to handle. Meanwhile, we just have to accept the fact that, guess what, is that whatever Chris ever really wanted out of life when he was younger, it was ultimately down to him to work towards it and to take care of himself when things go wrong, because Chris should be able to be responsible for himself. And I think when it comes to people who cannot be responsible for themselves, I think that's sort of, I think someone or somewhere needs to step in and say, well, if that's true, then we're gonna have to put in some very serious practices, or we're gonna have time, because it suggests again an issue about precognition, about whether a person may lack the ability to think before they act, or there was again requiring things that what we would call extra attention. There are so is Chris's egotism not being in check his parents' fault? Is it the government's fault? Is it the state of Virginia's fault? Is it our fault for some people enable or call Chris out on all of this? What exactly? How do we make this better for ourselves? It's not, because like I said again, whether you want to think there's anything to be, if there is right to be done for Chris, then unfortunately the issue you're going to find yourself when you try and see if you can try getting contact with Chris to see if you can get his life sorted out, is that you also have to bear in mind all of the other things that Chris did because he thought he was better than everyone else, including abusing his own mother. Some people can ironically see past that, like Prater, but then again, Prater's motives were not necessarily great, because he did it for money, basically, that's why. But I think it's one of those things why Noel at long last decided to step away, because Noel tried as hard as he could to tell Chris that don't do this, and Chris still denied his good advice anyway. Anyway, moving on. Chris's development isn't just delayed, it is arrested. His egocentrism has persisted well into his 40s, when most children usually grow up out of it at around the age of 7. Autism isn't to blame entirely. While autistic people's idiosyncrasies can make them appear self-centered on the surface, only a few are self-absorbed. Most still have interest in others, and many get help to develop coping strategies and social skills. Not Chris, though. Chris is still an egotist because he lives in a social time capsule that has allowed him to carry on for over a decade without a single life lesson. And he still lives in that time capsule because it is easy, it is comfortable, and people let him. Not even the powers that be, like when it comes down to Chris, because again, they'll get into a discussion about, you know, if Chris actually had a job or even applied for one more than 16 years later, that would be a little bit different. Unfortunately for Chris, he simply doesn't want one, because that would require breaking out of his habit. You see, Chris has a very comfortable niche. He's made a very, very comfortable bed to lie in, and whether or not we like it or not, it's still, in some ways, very, very profitable for Chris. The only issue, again, and this is something that Chris has never really caught the grasp of, is that outside of the fact that Chris wastes a lot of his money on absolute useless junk, or when he doesn't just, you know, give it away because people demand him for the destruction of Quickville, Chris and many people on welfare, it's not as if like they've deliberately chosen to be, you know, unemployed and to live off the state or anything like that, or live off, you know, taxpayers' money or anything like that. It's merely they've made the mistake of choosing a profession in which it is impossible to become rich or successful. Because when was the last time you ever heard of anybody on the dole or on the old rock and roll boast about success or something that they've done that is going to propel them to national stardom, when it is not about their, you know, economic status? The enablers. Drunk or not, they had me. At an old age where my mother was close to menopause and my father was a senior citizen, I was truly a miracle. Or you were lucky from the... this is ironically the only time in Chris's entire existence where he did apparently beat 19,000 other competitors in a race, you might be saying, which it is quite astounding when you think about it, but maybe for not the right or wrong reasons, you tell me. Anyway, speaking of education, it can also be said that the school system was yet another enabler in Chris's formative years. This was especially true at Manchester High. Chris's parents and the principal helped arrange the gal pals. This has resulted in Chris developing a rather warped view on women and friends. They let Chris believe they were legitimate friends, but in reality, they only stayed close with him out of pity and or to protect him. Chris received passing grades on schoolwork he didn't do correctly, yet still eventually graduated on honour roll, or so he says, presumably out of excessive pity on the teacher's part. Were that indeed the case, it might have encouraged Chris to put in less than half-baked effort into things and yet act like the end result is something spectacular. Well, here's the thing: if that really did happen, then if you're going to say that this Manchester High was more than keen to let Chris just not slip through the cracks, but literally glide through high school with there would have been there would have been a scandal about stuff like that, because, well, what happens when Bob isn't there, or when his gal pals are not there? Tell me what happens then. The information superhighway. A member of the Oregon Trail generation, Chris has made many significant memories before 1991, when the World Wide Web was made internet access feasible for the masses. However, he would use the internet regularly by the time he left high school. Born in 1982, he came of age in the year 2000, placing his childhood in a different millennium from his adulthood. Quite literally. Windows XP came out soon after, and with it came a multitude of prosumer creative programs, giving Chris something to do after kissing his gal pals goodbye. Not literally, but, With these new programs, Chris could record and share his own music, publish his comics online, and even create his own DVD. These services were previously reserved for professionals who had access to expensive studio equipment, but they were now in the hands of the masses. Later in the decade, Chris became involved with YouTube and Facebook, providing even more venues for self-publication. He no longer needed to wait for the news media to notice him. He could be the media. And you know what, it's something that goes through probably the minds of like hundreds of people even at that very moment. I mean, take a look at what's happened even in recent years, and don't worry guys, that I do plan on getting to making a elongated video about Jack Dorsey, because that guy is the bona fide example of basically someone who did fly not just too close to the sun, but he literally crash landed onto it and then was sent back down to Earth. As opposed to Johnny Somali, who flew too close to the sun and literally did a somersault into the very heart. Probably never to be seen on Earth again. Metaphor, by the way. But anyway, let's keep rolling. Chris joined YouTube much earlier than many would respected web celebs, during a time when most people saw it as a silly cat video website. It still is. And not a viable career that people would genuinely desire having. Unless, of course, your career is posting cat videos, but then again, cats are great anyway, and, you know... Actually, you know what? Well, before we go any further, I've got an idea. What's that one cat video? Piano. Did they silence the sound? And by the way, look at that, guys. Uploaded 7th of June 2007. I was 9 years old. And they couldn't get the sound to work. What a... Who took off the sound for that, by the way? What a... Where's the fair use, eh? That's another thing that's changed on the website in years, guys, is that copyright went literally out of control. Anyway, sorry, let's get back on track, shall we? But remember this. This was Chris's closest brush with fame since the local news. Blind luck and the cherry-picking fallacy. Meet Solitude, student featured in Nintendo Power. You know, it's kind of ironic, actually. The more I think about it, we've come this far into the article about Chris and his egotism, and we didn't even start off with one of perhaps the earliest example of Chris's winning the Watch and Win sweepstakes. Now, with that being said, Chris was probably just considered lucky, but, well, it's the sort. Then again, it developed the fantasy idea that as long as you participate in it, then you have about as much chances of winning as anyone else. Goodness knows how many other things Chris applied for during his time. Anyways, a contest or two here, a 9-second local TV blip there. The results are that outside events most people never experience have stroked Chris's already monstrous ego. Local boy levels up. Consider that Chris has produced a huge volume of fan mail, letters to the editor, internet commentary, and other drivel, partially because he doesn't have much else to do. Each letter to Nintendo is a message in a bottle, most of them never to return. But the one that does, on an official letterhead and addressed to Mr. C.W. Chandler, is confirmation of his celebrity status. And not just somebody in legal saying, well, we'll have to address this one way or another, because if there is people going out there claiming to be us, then we have to put a hard stop on this. Anyway, so here it is. Yeah, it says here that it goes on to say that Nintendo of America has some of the most devoted, enthusiastic fans of any game developer. Each week, they receive hundreds of thousands of suggestions about their games and systems. While they would love to use ideas from fans to develop actual products, due to the volume of the requests they receive and the resources it would take to process them, they do not accept unsolicited game or product ideas. but they are committed to being at the leading edge of game and hardware development, though, and they can be sure that they are constantly at work developing new and exciting products and game ideas. Now, here's the interesting part, where they quote about how I can actually go further about them changing their minds and actually accepting the idea and helping me. I would love to know where that happened, Chris, because it's not they didn't say that. Making it totally real with the video games and the TV animations and the action figures, and officially released my personal approved medals. They say that the best way to let other fans know about my idea or to generate hype about the future game I'd like to see is to post ideas to the forums on their sites. Mind you, Chris making a video about it, and ironically, it's one of those things where, surprisingly, it would have drawn a lot more attention because, well, that's sort of how it is. Because even by this point, Chris was already quite, not necessarily as well known, but he was sort of like a niche amongst curious internet forums who decided to take up Mims and Lucas's offer to see, well, take a look at what this guy is saying on this little board he did. The concept of form letters does not seem to occur to Chris, who seems to think the letter was written specifically for him, as if Chris didn't think his material was golden to begin with. He got a second nod from Nintendo Power for his epic Animal Crossing documentary, and a page in the PVCC's form is just icing on the cake. Even before his E-fame, Chris had plenty of evidence to convince himself that he was creative, and not just a high-volume, whiny jerk that had pestered his way to acknowledgement. As he graduated from PVCC in 2006, his writing shows that solitude was, in his mind, already tested. There was just some small threshold of notoriety or connections that needed to be breached to become a true media sensation. On top of that, Chris has a huge amount of free time to inject himself into situations like the McIntyre Park meetings, which allows him to cherry-pick more moments of recognition. A tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement by the local council seems cute to us, but it is serious business to him. And since Chris cherry-picks only the reinforcement that he wants, his legions of trolls just add to the fire. Delusion led him to believe that he had a legion of fans. For a time, a few hundred emails in his inbox confirmed it. Not seeming to realize that the subsequent, prank phone calls to his home address that Chris leaked may have suggested that this was probably having second thoughts. Then again, considering Chris didn't do much to suggest how to fix this, even though it was his fault, about says it all as well. Anyways, big fish, small pond. Chris is a small town girl living in a lonely world. Let's take a look at the cities of his life and whether or not he will take the midnight train. Ruckersville is such a tiny place that it only has one other notable resident, NASCAR driver Philip Morris, who is no Jeff Gordon or Danica Patrick. Again, proof be needed that this was obviously written by an American. Maybe someone from Virginia or something, I don't know. The neighbouring city of Charlottesville is mostly relevant for the UVA, the Monticello, and a handful of political rallies. It is a historic town, but it still has a very small town feel to it. It offers suburban conveniences like public parks and movie theatres and a multitude of strip malls, but it lacks the hallmarks of a big city. Sorry guys, tried to swallow and it just kind of like... Sorry about that. Chris's teenage environment, suburban Richmond, is much more robust. However, Chris has had a very sheltered adolescence and experienced little of what growing up in a large metropolitan area usually entails. Richmond also suffers from being far from any other major cities except for Washington, D.C. I would say that's a pretty big one right there, but what do I know? Like I said, I don't live in the United States. Chris rarely visits big cities that would quickly humble him. He lives in a very isolated world. His hometown has a smaller population than some high schools, and it isn't really known for up-and-coming artists. His main frame of reference was his classmates. Many of them took art as an elective, without any plans of becoming professionals. Additionally, him succeeding in spite of his autism might have only been relevant because the smaller school population made him one of the few autistic kids in class. Now, yes, that is probably true, and please bear in mind, guys, that even when Chris was in high school in 1996, or well, I'll say 1998, and I was born in 98, and that sets the precedent for just how long ago it was, because even a high school environment in 1998 from 27 years ago would have blown it out of proportion if it was in 98 or in 1908 for that matter. And, well, I suppose, even though it's not really one of those things I wanted to do, because the only way to really give some sort of perspective about what society, how it evolves and how it accustoms to things that weren't around before, you sort of have to compare it to when you were in school, which I'm not going to do, so moving on. Might have only been relevant because the smaller school population made him one of the few autistics in class. In reality, autism is a fairly common condition that's more often than not quite manageable. With the right help and support, and many autistic kids grew up to be successful autistic adults. Well, anyway, as I was saying before, remember, there was no such thing as an iPhone or an iPad back in 98, and I can only assume when they are saying, maybe the autistic kid, they weren't just considering, those who are very mild in their approach. They probably meant it as in the sort of person that you couldn't look at him and not say to yourself, that is absolutely the kid who has autism. Maybe they were dealing in superlatives far more in the late 90s than they did, well, when I was in school. Yeah, do you think that's probably true, guys, that it was because everybody knew each other more without having to bend forward as you do and just look at their phones all day and stuff like that? Do you think that's how it was? I'm saying that as though that didn't happen when I was in school anyway, but people only did that if they felt they could get away with it at any turn and stuff like that. But it wasn't that big a thing anyway. Moving on. Despite not being conventionally popular, Chris peaked in high school. He bases most of his merit on his various HS accomplishments, and he talks about the time as if it were the time of his life. He considers himself bilingual because he took Spanish. He takes pride in the fact that his school displayed his work publicly, even though schools do that all the time. Chris's comic book incarnation bears a strong resemblance to his high school self. Comic Chris doesn't wear glasses, the real Chris didn't wear them until 98, and he's in good shape, much like HS Chris, likely because of gym class. Which is also true, it's probably one of the few times where, exercise was actually compulsory, and Chris had no other choice but to do it. Chris would often bring up his placement on the honor roll as proof of his intelligence, and his mental health would sharply decline after graduation. Now, with that being said, it's probably no surprise, and it's not exactly as if Chris is the first person to experience the stink of reality when you're not surrounded by your high school environment. I went through a very similar period, but the difference is that, well, it's been and gone, but that doesn't mean I can't I don't hold memories of my time there, and it's not exactly as if there are things it's both for the good and the bad. except Chris would rather hold on to his onto the good rather than learn anything from when he went wrong. Unless, of course, you truly wanted to ask Chris, because Chris never really discloses, where he went wrong and stuff like that in high school. Maybe he did, but nothing that I can point to at this moment. Chris has taken his big fish mentality out of his small pond and transferred it to the large ocean of the internet, not knowing that it's filled with much larger sharks. One of Chris's sweethearts, Catherine, suggested that he ought to move to a place like San Francisco or Seattle or anywhere outside of suburban Virginia. She told him that these places are more LGBT friendly and have more job prospects, despite that they're probably a lot more expensive to live in. I mean, I would love... the Emerald City actually sounds like it would suit Chris quite well. And besides... But it would, of course, be living quite close to DSP, for what that's worth. And that these West Coast cities have higher minimum wages and more robust benefit and rehabilitation programs for autistic folks. She had several major points, but Chris just told her, but there's no San Francisco in Virginia. Right. Completely missing all of them. Wanting to have his cake and eat it too. Chris chose to stay in his small town southeastern bubble because it's easier for him. Yet he would clearly benefit from living in a more developed, liberal-minded area. I would like to imagine there's probably a little bit more to it than that, but there has got to be more to it than just Chris not wanting to just not live in Ruckersville anymore. I honestly do think there's got to be more to it than that. Is it because, well, he has literally no money whatsoever to move to Seattle or to San Francisco, or does he have absolutely no... He can't abandon his mom or anything like that? Back when Chris actually probably did sort of respect his mom. Because here's the thing, if Chris really was in it for older women, he should have just moved to Florida instead. No, because that's definitely not Florida. Chris would probably have tried to befriend a saltwater crocodile and would have been eaten in 10 minutes. Chris chose to stay in a small town anyway. In the same conversation, Chris stated the real reason for not leaving is that he doesn't want to leave his mother behind. Chris even brought up that he doesn't want to move out of state after Barb dies. This may be more of a symptom of, well, Chris is old enough to make his own mind up. And by the time you reach the age of 43, if you didn't do it before, you're probably not going to do it afterwards. Unless Chris really was about to lose his mind for the 4th time in 10 years. Or probably burn down another house. Chris did acknowledge the perks of moving out of his valley, but it's only logical for him to move out. What is a person obsessed with fame and art doing in a place known for neither? Why does a loud and proud bisexual trans woman want to live in a place where most residents are massively homophobic and or anti-trans? Why does the world's most documented autistic person want to live in an area that, by his own admission, doesn't understand autistic people? And why does someone who desperately wants a compatible partner limit himself to a tiny dating pool and then resort to long-distance troll dating, when there probably is someone for him in the Los Angeles area? And why, just why, does Chris want to treat his dwelling as a temple for all to flock to when it's so remote that Google Street View doesn't cover it? Because if Chris was to move to the Los Angeles area, again, it's very expensive to live in LA. And what avenues do you reckon Chris would have been able to gone to in LA? Monrovia, Laverne, Inglewood, South Central. Compton? Could you imagine Chris actually living in the LA projects? Now, don't get me wrong, guys. There are actually some there must be some really nice people who live in the projects. But I couldn't see Chris wanting to do it, because I think even Chris knows that, well, with someone like Chris's reputation, he is going to be a target for somebody. Yeah, people in the projects, I don't think they could care less who you are. I depends and stuff like that. Because, again, a larger pool means there are a lot bigger fish, and probably people who are less kind, and stuff like that. Anyway, according to the Quickie, because it's easy to be a big fish in a small pond, even after pissing off the other fish and getting banned from your favourite hangouts. That's possibly true as well, Chris is the big fish. And why would you want to move to a pond where there are even bigger fish? I mean, that might say more about how small, like a big fish in a really small pond. That's what Chris is in Ruckersville. Anyway, self-aggrandizing is fairly common in the family, and they can generally get away with it because of the small town mentality. Chris's family loves to bring up Bob's injection molding patent. He claims that he wouldn't even have a simple water bottle without it. In reality, plastic injection molding was invented before Bob was born. The Wikipedia article doesn't even mention Bob. All he designed was a control panel for one specific machine that has become obsolete for decades. If Bob didn't design it, someone else would have. But isn't that really true for all inventions, though? Even Cole Smithy, who managed to escape the Weston Chandler household as a young adult and go to have a fairly successful career, bills himself as the smartest film critic in the world. Which, even though that's quite a bold statement, well, you've got to go and build yourself up then. Actually, can I just, again, I want to go back to addressing what I said before about Chris moving out of Ruckersville for 1 second. Because this is something that Chris even brought up inadvertently in the revised ending to Solitude issue 11. Why didn't Chris just... I don't know where they would... I think it's like in Maryland or somewhere like that, but why didn't Chris just pull the plug on the internet altogether and live amongst the Amish? Because I'm not going to lie to you guys, I wouldn't mind, actually. I think it would be a fascinating experience to live amongst the Amish for like a year, maybe 2 years. Because think about it like this. Lack of technology, lack of like worrying about things or getting into arguments about people who you've never met and never will met, about things that don't affect you, happening thousands of miles away. And you could actually be in a small town and you could actually talk to... There is an incentive to actually get out because there is no other way of communicating with people. Limited technology, living in a different world, but living in a different period of time. That's actually a really interesting appeal to it, is that you're living in what I can assume was a simpler time, as an outdated expression as that is. But I think that would be... I think trying that out is nowhere near as bad as anyone would suspect. Because here's the thing. How do you know you will not enjoy something or you won't like something unless you actually try it? Because if Chris was wanting to do this for his own, safety and peace of mind, I think, honestly, Chris could absolutely do something like that. I mean, it's not exactly as if, there must be plenty of jobs going outside of, barn raising or, working on a farm, something like that. It must occur to Chris because, oh God, I say that, but I feel like I'm just beginning to say how, to be honest, I think that would be a really cool idea to actually live amongst the Amish. If there happens to be any Amish people watching this right now, 2 thumbs up. You're in my good books. We get 2 thumbs up. Anyway, what was my point? Oh yeah, that's right. Is that, well, maybe it's the sort of thing that Chris, maybe it's the sort of like knock to the noggin where you realize maybe you don't really need the internet after all. and you can actually live in a community, as opposed to, you know, Chris deciding to become a monk or living as a hermit. Actually being in a community where everybody actually gets along with each other and there's no blockades from things like technology or very limited use of it. Everybody just kind of adopts to it, and it's probably better actually to have that level of space away from a world which goes on and will continue to go on, but they don't have the burden or anything like that. That, to be honest, maybe I should go about trying to do that. A Geordie amongst the Amish. That sounds actually really cool. Right, okay, so after spending the last couple of minutes, like, coughing my lungs out, we are going to continue. So, this is the Chris and Narcissism section of Chris and his ego. I decided I was going to actually split up these things because I think there is a definitive split between Chris and his ego and Chris and his narcissism, and you're going to find out because they do sort of follow very similar paths, but for what they're worth, I was mistaken, but not wrong. This is according to Chris. That is not how that works. It's unlikely that Chris actually suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, although it's likely that someone else in his family does. While extreme self-centeredness and egotism is often conflated with the term narcissism, NPD is also an existing mental condition categorized by more factors, such as, but not limited to, emotional manipulation or split personalities for different people. Given the fact that Chris himself is too stupid to actually emotionally manipulate anyone, though not without trying, let alone not get manipulated himself, Chris most likely isn't a narcissist in the real sense. However, it's possible that Barbara, who did employ plenty of abusive NPD-like traits such as S-word baiting, might have influenced... And by the way, yes, absolutely, you heard that right. Barb was that paranoid about Chris actually flying the coop. She resorted to making threats, if you will, regarding her own, state of being, just to keep Chris in check. I'm not saying that for 1 second that Bob would ever actually do anything like that, but that's really friggin' low to manipulate someone into doing stuff like that. Anyway, Chris actually mentioned in a theoretical manner considering the S word on his Facebook post several times. And yes, by the way, that is true, and well, personally, a lot of people have suggested the idea that, well, because nobody took it seriously, that means that either they didn't believe in Chris, or Chris was only saying it because he wanted some attention. A lot of this is also very dependent on context, bear in mind, because there's a lot of context-related things as to when Chris stoops to saying stuff like that. Even for something as inconsequential as Sonic the Hedgehog's arms being recolored blue. Another noticeable aspect is Chris's need to shove his own name, initials, and creations every chance he gets, especially other people's works, if it guarantees fame. With that being said, while a lot of factors like his relentless attention whoring or his lack of empathy coincide with symptoms of the disorder, factors of his ego were mostly results of his shitty upbringing and awful luck for winning contests, giving him a huge sense of self-importance. Not to mention his lack of empathy for others was also partly caused by his autism. If Chris does have NPD, he likely has a low-functioning variant of the disorder, and it may be harder to delineate his potential NPD symptoms from established ASD ones. Further reading is required to confirm the difference. Actually, let's I'm going to keep that to one side for the moment because that might be something we can have a discussion about later on. Manifestations. Chris's egotism manifests itself in a variety of ways. Unwarranted self-importance. I have had way over 1 million fans worldwide since I went in online in before 2000. Where are these fuckers then, Chris? Where are they? And also this, very gracious. I'm sorry for using your name in vain, and when I construed PVCC citizens and made you look like a fool about me for 6 years, Mary Lee Walsh. And I'm sorry for letting Surreal Ryan let away with it for so long. I pray we can put this whole mess behind us, Mrs. Walsh. Yeah, bear in mind, Chris started all of this with Mary Lee Walsh, and Chris is only now Chris could have avoided all of this, and bear in mind with what happened afterwards. Well, we'll get to that. As overwhelming as Chris's unwarranted self-importance is, it's easy for the novice observer to get lost in the sea of Sonichu shit and assume he's just confident in his e-fame. Of course, you say, he's got 1 billion hits on YouTube and 1,000 emails in his mailbox. He's going to think he's hot shit, like every other laughed at not what dumbass on the internet. But nothing sums up Chris's deep and abiding USI like this missive to Mary Lee Walsh. Mary, I've slept on it, and I have realised that note hanging is not the way to get attention. And I don't really want to meet with you either, nor you nor Susan, no offence. I'll tell you what, let's forget the meeting, and if you allow my newsletter to stay in distribution, I will do all of the following. I will never hang notes on the wall again. I'll consider stopping my silent treatment on Susan, and I'll consider knocking you and Susan up. Yeah, of course, that's a very, very poorly worded there, Chris. Up my scale of respect, each by 2 points. 0 equals no respect, and 10 equals respect. Please reply via email. Christian C. To say that this didn't work should come to a surprise of absolutely nobody, and, well, it didn't work. E-fame just adds a whole new dimension. He was a misunderstood genius before, now he's a misunderstood genius with a personal army. I'm working on it. Let me do that stupid video so I can tell everybody in my command to help me get everything off of the internet. This is when Chris, they tried to get Greene County, the police department involved about the concerns about the hoarding situation. It's so bad that when Chris meets someone new who claims not to know who he is, he seems skeptical and surprised. Y'all should know me by now, but if you don't, I am Christian Western Chandler, the original creator of Sonichu, the Electric Hedgehog Pokemon, back on March 17th, 2000. And bear in mind, this was his second YouTube video. The instant gratification, instant acknowledgement, and instant attention, good or bad, that has come with his minor e-fame of the last few years has thoroughly convinced Chris that people do read everything he writes, and that his YouTube messages invariably get to his target audience. I realize I am famous like a princess. Chris on Twitter in October 2017. Unfortunately, the fame Chris seems to revel in is that of Princess Diana. Notable resident in Ruckersville, Virginia, alongside a NASCAR racer, and about the 29,000th most popular individual in this world. So where is the Wikipedia article about me? That seems more like a demand than a question. And also, I doubt that, Chris. By that token, you'd be considering yourself more popular than some world leaders. He also describes himself as managing the Veracity team in high school, when actually he was a water boy. But if, even after all of this, you're still not convinced that Chris has unwarranted self-importance issues, consider this little tidbit. He posted autographed pictures of himself on eBay, looking like this. I mean, aside from the fact it looks as if Chris got bitten by a spider, and Chris is trying to make his smile about as wide as his belly, and maybe, I don't know, Chris could have maybe, I don't know, sorted his hair out somewhat. I'm not entirely sure how, but misdiagnosing narcissism Asperger's by Sam Vakin. Make of that what you will. Anyway, also, fixation on self-image. Chris has created many avatars of himself through several mediums. Pogs. Yes, Chris, Pogs of all. I mean, again, Chris, this was the 80s Chris was growing up in. As Christian Western China in comic form, a Lego figurine as the leader, no doubt. Super Smash Brothers. More avatar, more and one for Christine, respectively. Amiibo figurines, Lego figurines, a plasticine doll, a Skylanders avatar, a shirt, card, and 3D figurine of his Skylanders costing at least $90, as a Transformer. That almost sounds like a clever play on words, but probably isn't. As an MLP character, as a doppelganger of an MLP as an Equestria Girl character, a second Christine doll, Funkos. Just grow up, you guys. And finally, as a Twilight's Secret Shipfic folder card, featuring many of his own inserts, including multiple iterations of his inserts. Why didn't Chris just literally put up, have mirrored walls all over his house if he likes looking at himself that much? Good question. Moving on. Persecution complex. Chris has a lot of problems, and even the ones he takes responsibility for are still too much out of his hands. His school was mean to him. He didn't deserve that F in English or the one in CAD, and he doesn't deserve the 24/7 trolling, among other things. And if that wasn't enough, he thinks every authority figure in the land is conspiring against his love quest. Then in mid-October, the quote-unquote Dean of Student Services, Mary Lee Walsh, approached me and pulled my sign away from me and told me, "You're not allowed to find true love here." My heart was shattered that very moment. Despite the fact that probably Chris misconstrued what was going on, and, well, if Chris actually had stopped to listen, then this could have been averted. But Chris, as I mentioned before, Chris only chooses to listen to what he wants to hear. Compounding this was him also having to deal with a quagmire of a war against gay rumours that started those damn trolls kept spreading about him, with a second front versus the copyright violating thieves. It's out of my control. I don't know where to go. I don't know where to go. A great example of Chris's persecution complex in the Greene County conspiracy video, where Chris blamed the Greene County School Board for pretty much every misfortune in life, from being banned from the game place to becoming the social outcast that we all know and tolerate, thereby cementing the notion that Chris will never take responsibility for his actions. One of the only times Chris ever actually stepped up and admitted responsibility was when he accidentally erased his PlayStation 3's data. Naivete. Chris's simple-mindedness and gullibility are legendary. Like George W. Bush, he only deals in absolutes. Or also deals in invasions, but let's skim past that. Either you're with him or you're against him. This has been very obvious in his answers to the mailbag, where he refuses to listen to any talk, even from professionals, about the similarity between Asperger's syndrome and autism, denies that there are any shortcomings in his work, and shrugs off any advice about how to improve his health or appearance, labeling anyone who suggests he has any kind of shortcoming a troll. Chris equates honesty with divulging every last detail about his life. Nothing is too candid for Chris, getting haircuts, drinking his own semen, shitting his pants, having incestuous dreams, or even giving away his phone number and home address. The only thing he hasn't done with wild abandon is give away his social security number. And when that happens, it won't be a surprise to anybody. I still think we've got a very long way to go before that happens, and also I don't think Chris would have done that. His gullibility is outstanding. No matter how many times it's happened before, Chris is easily led around by trolls promising China, threatening his identity, and most damaging of all, playing into his otherworldly delusions and fantasies. The earlier trolling schemes, such as Blanca, Pandahalo, and Jimmy Hill, got Chris to jump through hoops and expose so much information about Chris and his personality that they had to start this very wiki to keep track of it all. Another example of Chris's gullibility is one Miss Jacqueline Romy, a sweetheart that Chris met earlier in 2011. Despite her obviously being a troll, proven by a mysterious leak of videos that were sent only to Jackie on February 2012, and her having him produce many embarrassing videos, Chris would continually renew his relationship with her. In 2009 and 2010, Chris slowly began to learn to distrust trolls or to keep more of his information secure. However, many of his trolls believe this is akin to putting a shock collar on an animal, eventually to stop being shocked. Not because they actually understand or care, an animal will start doing as it's told. Over the years, Chris's gullibility would come back in varying ways, reaching a boiling point in 2017. When the idea guys got a hold of him, as it turned out, the easiest way to exploit Chris's gullibility was to appeal to his habit of escapism, especially during the general turmoil he faced around the time. The idea guys heavily exploited him by near permanently altering his fantasy world and state of mind, with their effects so harsh that they even when their iron grip was let go the following year, Chris continues to believe the things that they put into his head. Most infamously, he now believed he was a goddess, and later on, the outright reincarnation of Jesus Christ, who would bring forth a dimensional merge on the world that, among other things, would take care of problems like his financial debt. As in the $6,000 that Chris gave to the idea guys just because they asked for it or something, or they said they were going to blow up Quickville or something, and Chris apparently just went along with it. Hubris, the pride before the fall. I'd say all round, you see, what like a perfect circle. You see, the problem is that I have too many skills that I am good at. You might say that I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. Right, okay. Chris got the last part right. I can agree with that much. And what skills are these, Chris? Meanwhile, yeah, exactly. I love myself. Chris apparently needed to tell the world this. But whether or not this is even true either is a pretty good point. And bear in mind, he wrote this on Mother's Day as well. Whatever. Numerous. It's the same reason why I kind of like rolled my eyes at people when they have like those big posters or shirts with "I love me" or stuff like that. I mean, fair enough, but like, I'm sorry that I didn't realize that my self-esteem was in any doubt whatsoever, that I had to pay somebody money to have it put on a shirt and to walk around to let people know that I also paid for a shirt, to reinforce a notion that nobody really cared for, and one that I didn't even think was even need addressing at all. So there we are. Glad we saw that was not a close one. Numerous times, Chris has shown that he believes he has powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal autistics. In fact, so much so that this attitude has transcended mere hubris. Instead, it more resembles a mental illness. Not only is Chris convinced that his writing, musical talents, and art are without peer, or criticism, he also believes he has supernatural powers along the lines of Wicca or voodoo. And he doesn't just have the power to create, he also has the power to destroy. This line of thinking is exemplified by Chris's acceptance that Ryan Cash committed the S-word just because he withheld Sonichu updates. He would worsen when he believed that worsen was a real word. That his curse actually caused Liquid Chris and Mary Lee Walsh to have some sort of horror before them. But those are just the most insane moments of cognitive dissonance. What about the time he went into hysterics when he didn't get recognition for his art at his high school graduation? I should have been highly recognized for my artistic talents. I showed in my many art classes for the award ceremonies before graduation day. I felt crestfallen greatly for not getting recognized for any of my talents. I excelled in math too, for the love of God. Chris on his Wikipedia page, not realizing that public schools display students' art all the time. And Chris is not the only person who's actually ever done good at math in school. Or his reaction to the Parappa the Rapper. Now listen, again, as Chris being a teenager during this, maybe debatable about, well, it's Chris was still too young. This, when Chris was in his mid-20s, definitely not. So that's sworn on my autism, justice will be served to the 7 people of those 4 videos. That seems almost like a threat there, Chris. You may want to be careful about that. Meanwhile, all of the above is consistent with the behavior of small children, who, isolated from the real world by a lack of comprehension and limited mobility, believe themselves to be godlike beings. This belief is gradually destroyed as the child goes to school and encounters outside authority, leading to their acknowledgement of the fact they are, in fact, ordinary people. Of course, since Chris is not only autistic but also extremely sheltered, he still manages to cling to this belief by focusing on specific aspects of his life and constructing elaborate fantasy worlds. This is also probably why he sees mundane chores as horrific trials of strength and will. In psychological terms, this can be referred to as psychological neoteny. Is that right, neoteny? Am I getting that right? Which is basically the retention of juvenile traits well into physical maturity. Also consistent with his childlike mindset, his apparent belief that he has supernatural powers. In Freudian terms, this is referred to as an omnipotence of thought. Basically, in the same way he does with religion, Chris cherry-picks elements of his life to validate his fantasy of control, which is more systematically displayed in the Sonichu comics. Taking this into consideration, it's likely that Magi-chan is yet another Mary Sue for Chris, serving as a kind of avatar for his desire for ultimate authority. Why he felt it necessary to make another character to fill this role is unclear, considering he's already established himself as the one true god of Quickville. Another aspect of Chris's arrogance, and again caused by his childish way of viewing the world, is visible in a phone call with Alec Benson-Leary, the creator of Asperchu. In the call, it is obvious Chris does not follow a mature procedure for developing a stance on issues. Where normally an individual will learn information about the issue and from then decide how they feel about said issue, Chris does it the other way around and decides how he feels about something, then refuses to believe, understand, acknowledge, or even change his attitude when people will call him out on this, or even humour any evidence to the contrary. While most people have very strong beliefs in some issues, so much that they automatically have a prejudice against people believing differently, politics, religion, etc., Chris has this perspective on everything. He takes a position on matters, then finds ways to back it up and ignores all evidence for the opposing viewpoint. This is called a confirmation bias. For example, Chris has decided gay people are bad, so he selectively finds information that backs up his stance on the matter and ignores anything anyone will tell him about why his homophobia is bad and makes him a bad person. He will then go as far as to pretend he can cure homosexuality with his own blood, unless disliking homosexual means he may not get laid. It's, I could go into more detail about another example that's been cropping up on, like, X and stuff like that about confirmation bias. But I don't really feel like I need to do that right now because this video is already long enough as it is, and I don't want to start a small civil war in the comments. So I won't. I'll keep that firmly under wraps. So let's move on. This is most apparent when he takes two contrary positions about a similar topic. The obvious example of this is Chris's understanding of the way parody functions. Chris will defend his right to make solitude to the defend solitude to the hilt by claiming it is a parody in a legal sense, but then he states that aspatu is a bad thing because it is a parody of a parody. As you can see, Chris has decided that he has every right to make solitude, so he backs this up with statements about his right to parody existing trademark characters. But conversely, he has decided aspatu is bad, so he supports this position by stating it is a parody of his legitimate work. Yeah, solitude is about as legitimate as probably my original characters, to be fair. A literal example of the pride before the fall would be Chris's series of Facebook posts between April and June of 2012. In April of 2012, Chris believed that he had utterly fooled the trolls when he made a series of posts mocking them. He even went so far as to post screenshots of the Quickie Forum members talking about it. Note that in several of the screenshots, Chris believed that he had uncovered a scheme to start a poster campaign about him in Charlottesville. According to his Facebook post dated 4th of June 2012, he had called the cops and basically admitted that he completely fell for it. He then recorded an angry voicemail greeting before quickly deleting it. Compared to an earlier voicemail he made, one can clearly see how humbled he was. A more recent example of Chris's pride and ego superseding the efforts of people around him can be seen in Solitude Special 5, in which the captain vociferously praises Chris, flanked by his creations for providing a good service to all of us in this world, when in reality, the opposite was true. Chris had been manipulated by the idea guys, and the captain, a member of the guard dogs, was the actual person providing said services in attempting to break Chris free of their influence. I believe this is it's what they refer to as pampering, or pandering, if you will. Materialism. I want Julie. Yeah, love is my first priority, but I want my stuff back. It is clear that Chris is a materialist, a common symptom of narcissistic personality disorder. Also, before we go any further with this, it should be pointed out that Chris, during his first hearing when he was in jail, apparently threw a tantrum in court by stamping his feet saying, "Can't I just get my stuff back from 14 Branch Lane?" And they said no. And Chris kicked off with them. Buying and hoarding large amounts of crap that make him feel good about himself. He may even believe that his unhealthy amount of children's toys might attract a sweetheart. I don't know, well, they say age is just a number, but I feel like Chris might want to... Yeah, that's the thing, is that if I didn't know better, I would have felt like Chris was building some sort of soft play dungeon. When any human being would clearly see that this man is delusional. He also doesn't seem to have a problem with getting money for sitting on his ass, claiming he can get more from his tugboat than he could at an actual job. Which, that's just... Only people who know absolutely nothing about the economy or how, you know, what people get paid. Like, Chris has absolutely no idea. Why Chris thinks that's true, I have no idea. He has absolutely no concept of money, nor does he have any semblance of value towards money either, and believes he is entitled to everything he can buy or get his greasy, unclean palms on as much as possible. This stems from childhood, and when Barbara would take Chris to the toy store and encourage him to talk by giving him toys if he could read their names out loud. Ever since, he's believed that just by being autistic, he deserves everything he can get his grubby hands on. This mixture of compulsive hoarding, compulsive shopping, and autism is bad news all the way. He's compulsively hoarded all of his toys and video games because he wants to give them to his daughter in the future. He also seems to enjoy collecting things, which may explain why Pokemon appeals to him. Chris compulsively bought everything he could on the PS3, including but not limited to games he owns but has never played or even opened the box on, and is more concerned with trophies than actual gameplay. Most of the games he's downloaded have never been played. And that's not an understatement, by the way. That is true. Chris says, they are literally collecting dust from the moment they were bought. But the important thing is that, and how much money was Chris spending on games that he literally never played? That's also what I want to know. Hoarding items in cases other than OCD is a sign of intellectual disability in older children. He may have inherited this behavior from his parents, especially Bob. Not even a house fire that set most of his items ablaze or getting exiled from said house can stop his hoarding habits. Tender misanthropy. A tender misanthrope is, by definition, someone who despises humanity in general. That's going a bit far, that, isn't it? But is ever ready to make an exception for the real people. In other words, an egotist who pretends to be benevolent. While it's obvious that Chris is an egotist, he truly believes he is benevolent. He is the perfect example of a tender misanthrope, screaming death threats at what he knows of humanity, seeing as the only social contact he gets is from the internet, whilst also believing that he is a kind, loving person who can give advice and act as a role model for children. You are having a laugh, Chris. You are having a giraffe, aren't you? Are you sure about that? What is it? What if you highlight this? Yeah, I thought so. Another part of the definition states that a tender misanthrope feels certain of being able to love real people if only they can be found, or, failing that, to transfer existing false people into idealized real people through social and political programs of the tender misanthrope's own making. The way that Chris treats gay people, seeing as he hates them all, no matter what he says, and wants to turn them straight by placing them into co-ed prisons, reprogramming them into straights via concentration camps, or by creating a vaccine that cures homosexuality, certainly fits this description. The fact that he also generalizes trolls as gay people also supports this. If that does not convince you that Chris feels he can make people into what he can emotionally attach himself to, there are also other obvious examples in this unique delivery of his intentions. And if that sounds pretty bleak, well, this is not dark psychology. This is like the darkest psychology, because, well, what else are you meant to think about somebody who really has that arrogant standard about the world? Excuse me. Disregard of rules of conduct online. Do not delete nor censor my bombastic protest. Chris has little regard for the rules of online communities. When he joins up on websites, he tends to do things his way. He assumes that his own niche in these websites is under his absolute control. For example, he assumed that Wikipedia would allow him to post anything on his personal user page, or that Encyclopedia Dramatica would remove material critical to him if he just asked nicely. Sites like DeviantArt and YouTube allow community participation. Chris simply disallowed comments, or later on just ignored every comment he received. Chris also assumes that when other people host websites for him, in case of Wikipedia, he's given the final say on all matters. His record for getting permabanned is currently at 2 weeks on Flipnote when he foolishly tried to re-upload Flipnotes that had been removed for breaking the rules without bothering to find out why they had been removed in the first place. Smack your head against a wall just to see if you can get through it, and if it doesn't work, smack it even harder. That's what it reads to me at any rate. His Facebook account encountered a cycle in July 2015 where it would be removed and put back up again. Some of Chris's posts contained sexual content such as photos of lizards mating, thumbnails of lesbian sex, screenshots of sexting, and a drawing in which he was drenched in lemonade through a china-shaped melon. Which he even bragged about how his haters would be offended by it. If Chris is banned from a website, he will often simply make a new account to circumnavigate it, even if this violates the website's rules, such as using like sock puppet accounts, which is another thing he refuses to accept. Similarly, if he is blocked by somebody he wants to talk to, he might even construct a fake account under the guise of one of his OCs to bypass the block, which technically counts as stalking, and somebody could have just pressed charges and never would have had to deal with Chris ever again. Because that's the thing as well. If somebody had reported Chris for stalking, then there could have been, serious limitations for Chris online. Because, well, think about how that looks and stuff like that. And that's the again, with the cosh of the law weighing around his neck, it would have been the sort of thing to make Chris realize what to do and what not to do. That would have changed his tune very, very quickly. Surrendering information. If there is one thing that Chris's ego would simply not allow, it's suppressing himself and giving away too much information about himself. If he feels that bragging about something would give him a one-up against the trolls or make himself look good, he'll freely announce it for everyone to hear. The most glaring example of this is this entire wiki, which was created using a lot of information provided by Chris himself. Back in the day, Chris viewed himself as an extremely popular internet celebrity with a true and loyal fan base, and as such would divulge a lot of information about himself so people would know him better, inclusive of personal information that nobody in their right mind would give away, because they understand that, that they do not need to know, and it could lead to very serious issues in this day and age, even as far back as 2007. However, there are times when he would do the opposite and surrender information that he knew would make him look horrendously bad, sometimes without provocation whatsoever. His enthusiastic revelation of his own fecal incontinence is the shining example of this. Or the shining turd example of this. I am so not clever. Whilst this practice has diminished in recent times, well, when it did happen, it was more than enough to fill the docket. With Chris making himself scarce out of fear that trolls would have more ammunition to use against him, his habit of needlessly surrendering information still manages to surface. For example, when he claimed to lose his virginity, he couldn't help but announce it on his Facebook page, all the while swearing up and down that he would never divulge any details about it to the trolls. Mere weeks later, more details emerged on Facebook, leading to speculation that he might actually buy a hooker, since we all know the inevitable end result of his sweetheart search. Which he ended up, what's this, I've lost track as my phone's making noises again. Which he ended up confirming on the 1st of May, along with attending a Mythbusters tour something which wasn't even brought up but still revealed anyway. All the while claiming to retain button-lipped on the matter. Only time would tell if and when Chris finally reveals everything to silence his naysayers. After all, it wouldn't be the first time it's happened either. Sure enough, in December of 2014, a leaked account of Chris's experience with the hooker was revealed on the Kiwi farms. He just never learns. In 2013, Chris's habit of needlessly surrendering information returned with a vengeance. Chris threw a temper tantrum on Facebook, and many would have assumed that it was business as usual, until Chris made the fatal mistake of revealing the reason why he went on the warpath. Somebody had uploaded his status updates, complete with the ones that were hidden, onto an Imager account. Aside from the usual whining about how lonely he was, these screen caps not only revealed what he was up to in the silence between 2011 and 2013, but also uncovered a very ugly side of Chris. One post in particular revealed that he was angry at the fact that Mims had a girlfriend and demanded that somebody should kill her, simply because Mims was a jerk. The fact remains that the one who revealed all of this unsavory information was not the trolls, as Chris would try to have you believe, but himself. The next year, Chris encountered a man trying to put out a bushfire near his house. However, he believed he was trying to make it worse, and thus uploaded the bushfire video, wherein he wound up dropping the address of the rental house in the video title. Friggin' idiot. In 2021, this would eventually prove to be Chris's ultimate downfall. In late July 2021, Chris told Bella that he had sexual intercourse with Barbara Chandler, his own mother, even going so far as to describe the acts in uncomfortably graphic detail. One would think that Chris, being in the highly delusional state that he was in at the time, could have easily been dismissed here, until we confirmed that it was all true when pressed by the truth by Dylan Thomas. And by Noel as well, but yeah. As a consequence, many horrified listeners immediately contacted law enforcement, as incest is a Class 5 felony in the state of Virginia. Even more consequences would follow. Chris was removed from his home via an emergency protective order and became the center of a humongous media circus, and even had Weens tracking him down in real life, resulting in his eventual arrest on stream on the 1st of August 2021. What a time to be alive, guys. For everyone involved, apart from those who didn't have anything to do with this, and you just were waking up to why is everybody getting in a tizzy over this for? Fishing for sympathy. I am so smart, and yet I still have a lot to learn. I still have so much to learn. Yeah, that ought to do it. In many conversations with Chris, there have been quite a few instances where he would outright fish for sympathy, in the hopes that people would take pity on him and, in so doing, make him feel better about himself. One such example is the father call, where Chris constantly talks about the trials and tribulations in his life to an unimpressed Matthew Devoria, from whom he was trying to seek approval to date his daughter. And said trials and tribulations amounted to housework and being teased on the internet, which Chris felt was on par with Matthew carrying his dead friend's body during the war. In his later email exchanges with Jackie, Chris is quick to paint himself as a misunderstood victim whenever Jackie rips him a new one over issues such as his habit of lying, being a hypocrite, and even being inconsiderate towards her. Even in recent times, he was not cut out of this habit, with his Facebook and Twitter entries blaming his trolls for making his life a living hell. One in particular lamenting that nobody cares about him except for his own mother. The attention he gets from his mother, Barbara Chandler, and his friend Anna McLaren is textbook mollycoddling at best. Chris has spent his entire life being catered to by his parents, notably well past the point of social acceptance, to the point where he depends on them to bail him out of his numerous messes that he gets himself into. Only after Chris abandons them and stuff like that, if you know anything about the Blue Arms incident. It comes as no surprise, then, that this, combined with him being autistic, has poisoned Chris's mind into thinking that this is how everybody should treat him by default. And if people don't see things his way, he'll be more than happy to point out the heavy burdens he faces daily, almost as if he expects them to instantly take back their mean words and feel sorry for him. The habit of wanting sympathy is so ingrained in Chris that he instinctively hedges when he makes a positive statement about himself. An example is from a video in which he said, "I am so smart," and immediately followed by downplaying it and saying that he still had much to learn. Fooling, no, but that's the thing as well. Chris can say he's so smart, but unfortunately nobody is believing this. War against the ego. One of the main forces opposing Chris's ego are the White Knights. These misguided souls have attempted to get Chris to understand that what he's doing is ridiculous and that he needs to grow up. Instead, he brushed them all aside, assuring himself that he was true and honest and could do no wrong. One of the more popular White Knights, Vivian G, who later became a troll, when she couldn't get through to Chris. That takes some effort, that, doesn't it? When asked to get real psychiatric help, Chris has said that his church counselor, Rocky Shoemaker, is enough for him, and that she could do so much more than someone with an actual legitimate degree in that field. He seems to believe that because her title includes the word counselor, she is every bit as qualified as a real doctor. The fact that most pastoral counselors see people for free probably helps as well, since Chris would never spend part of his precious monthly tugboat on something useful when there are video games to buy. There were even some instances where it seemed that the trolls had made a breakthrough by breaking Chris, only for him to get right back up and continue with his antics. An example of this would be Casey, who led Chris on for a while until she dropped the bombshell that she was going to marry Liquid Chris, but not before having her father point out every single thing that is wrong with Chris. A normal person would have been utterly devastated by this turn of events, and some would even use this experience to better themselves. Chris, on the other hand, perked right back up when he obtained a letter validating Sonichu, forgetting about Casey a mere days, just like she had predicted, until Chris would fall into the cycle all over again. Just as long as anybody pays any attention to Chris whatsoever, that's just about all he needs. There's, among many other things as well, and there's also examples of Chris's ego in the real world, and if you thought this was long enough already, well, we'll cover this as sort of like a little bit of a, you know what, we're here anyway, we could include this, just as a very, epilogal, a way to sum all this up. So, in the real world, school, Manchester High School. When Chris graduated from high school, he actually cried because he believed that he deserved a number of artistic awards for his artwork. By his own admission, he also made a scene and ran out after getting his diploma, eventually having to be consoled by both his mother and gal pal Tiffany Gowan. PVCC. After being expelled for his appalling behavior by the student's dean, Chris felt the need to write to then standing President of the United States, George W. Bush, the idea that a standing president would be willing to use his clout to reverse a local community college's administration decision is ludicrous at best. Public places. The game place. Chris, a regular patron, acted as if he owned the store. He was rude to the other customers and staff, was openly racist and homophobic to others, abused the access to a flat-screen television, and was an all-around pain for the manager and later owner, Michael Snyder. After many antics, he was banned from the place, first temporarily for going into the back room without permission, then permanently after yelling at a kid. Chris filmed a half-assed apology 9 months later, not because he was sorry for his actions, but because the store was the only place in the area that had Eye of Judgment cards. Chris also attempted to incite harassment of employees of the store, using the very fans he had chastised mere weeks earlier simply because Michael had refused to remove his ban. Jail. During his time in jail, following the 28th of October 2011 incident, Chris stated he refused to eat the prison food, since he had never done it, and was not going to start anytime soon, and eating the food was beneath him. Later on, after being sent to jail following the incestuous affair, Chris writes a letter saying that his life events at present and so far can directly be compared and matched with what had been chronicled of none other than Jesus Christ of Nazareth in any Holy Bible. GameStop. Following the incident of the 26th of December 2014, where he was ordered to get out of a GameStop he was previously banned from for vandalizing their Sonic Boom displays, and then maced a male employee on the way out, he had went to Facebook to say that he in fact was the victim of the whole situation. The endgames. Chris's behaviour at this card game shop was only slightly better than his behaviour at the game place, with him generally acting like he was some sort of important celebrity. He would loudly sing and wail to his own music, pretend his imaginary friends were his bodyguards, would allegedly throw outbursts over things like him accidentally dropping his medallion, and even play Sonichu on one of the store's signs. Much like before, after many antics, he would be banned from the store, partly for getting into an argument with a game judge, and partly for getting into another argument with the store manager. The aforementioned sign for the store's Pokemon League got thrown away, and when Chris was told that his OC wasn't a real Pokemon character and shouldn't be displayed in the store, he inevitably got angry. Chris would demand several times to be unbanned, saying that he needed help playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that it would help bring the dimensional merge, but the store wouldn't budge. Chris then angrily claimed that they sullied their reputation bad when they banned him, and anonymously sent them a letter with a drawing of a creepy stare. With people. Sarah Nicole Hammer, one of Chris's first crushes. Chris made the small booklet, Chris plus Sarah's Life Shares, in an attempt to win her over on her 21st birthday. The booklet was merely a major ego trip, talking more about him and less about her, with the two of them replaced with Solichu and Rosechew. He later cast her in his Solichu comic and having her break up with Wes Isley before disposing her when she was married away to William Spicer. Megan Schroeder. For the longest time, Chris actually believed that he and Megan were going out as boyfriend and girlfriend. He even attacked someone for getting near Megan. When the infamous She Came for Quick.jpg picture was discovered, Chris actually thought that the real reason was because she was upset because she wasn't used to sexual things, and not the fact that she realized that Chris saw her as nothing more than a sex toy. He then tried to make Megan believe that the bullying from those amongst ED was much worse than the fact that he did to the picture because he was afraid of trying to rap her. He also insisted that he was under much more emotional pain than she was, somehow believing that trolls posting pictures of Rosechew with a pickle on the internet was worse than a so-called friend sexually harassing and drawing porn of you. Chris would later blame ED for the fact that he lost her friendship, not caring it was his fault in the first place, and nobody else's. Jerkops. Thanks to Chris's various runs-in with the law, Chris has a very skewed view of law enforcement. After being tossed out of Walmart and Target, he deemed that security guards were evil and just trying to play Kick the Autistic and prevent him from completing his love quest. However, following his arrest on the 28th of October 2011, Chris has now assumed that all law enforcement is evil and has gone out of his way to make sure that they never take him into any sort of custody again. which hasn't worked out for him. Also because Chris couldn't maintain the law to save his life anyway. Vanessa Hudgens. Joshua Martinez used the identity of the High School Musical star to troll Chris by pretending Vanessa wanted to ride his duck. The fact that Chris actually believed a bona fide celebrity wanted to give her China speaks volumes about his hubris. The Sonichu promotional video. In the part 2 of his video, Chris shows to the camera an elegant drawing of the two main heroes of the comic book made by a fan called Ali. Not only does he proceed to comment, Rosie's tale was wrong, but I'll forgive her, he presents a drawing made by himself as the better version. I would have given Chris a slap for saying something like that, because that's just... Shigure Miyamoto. Chris was convinced that Miyamoto, who is a world-famous video game designer and creator of beloved and legendary franchises like Super Mario Bros., Donkey Kong, The Legend of Zelda, and Star Fox, would not only be honored to meet him, but in fact even more honored to meet Chris than Chris would be to meet him. Then, even after having his game proposal rejected by Miyamoto, Chris still remained convinced that Miyamoto was only holding out on him and would surely accept his offer in the near future. Jackie. In the final email exchanges between the two, Jackie quite accurately pointed out many of Chris's flaws, also taking the time to rationally explain what he was doing wrong and what he could do to fix things. However, Chris took it the wrong way, claiming that she was being mean to him and hating him by pointing out his flaws, still believing himself to be flawless and special. Michael Snyder. Imagine what would happen if, Bob didn't die in 2011. How long that would be still going on for. Anyway, Michael Snyder. Chris has long held enmity towards him for rightfully banning him from the game place because of his antics, not caring that it was his fault in the first place. So what has Chris got to be angry for then? Even going on to develop a paranoid delusion that Michael Snyder's the ringleader of a conspiracy hell-bent on persecuting him because he's autistic. After the fallout from the Simola and Wallflower incidents, Chris rekindled his efforts to get unbanned from the game place as part of getting back to the real world and failed miserably. This has led Chris to throw anti-Semitic slurs, for example calling Michael a Jew, despite the fact that Michael Snyder is not Jewish, and attempting vehicular assault at least twice. During the July 2012 trial, Chris had the gall to call him a thieving liar before the judge, in a court, and even though Snyder was far more lenient as he didn't want to have a felony on his record, which would have risked a contempt of court and the plea bargain he invalidated. Even as late as January 2018, years after the store was closed, he still holds serious animosity towards him. Online. Little Big Planet. When Chris had shown up on the Little Big Planet community and posted videos addressed to them, he once again said people should know him by now. He immediately assumed people would praise him for his levels, especially the collector's case, which he thought was the most original Little Big Planet level idea ever. Web Soup. When Chris learned that one of his videos was featured on an episode, he took it as a good thing, not realizing that the show made fun of people on the internet. Downsize Sega. On the 2nd of February 2015, Chris took credit for Sega's downsizing, stating that him and his Pale Arm Crusaders, with their boycotting, had damaged Sega enough to force them to close office. This is despite the fact that normal market forces had been the supposed cause. Literally, nobody is joining Chris on his fight against the Blue Arms, and Sega is the publisher of all Sonic games. This gives some nicely needed recent perspective on the size of his ego. Sonic Forces. In November 2017, after playing through the newest Sonic game, Chris unlocked customizable options for the avatar section. One of these included eyes with heterochromia. Chris immediately assumed the unlockable was inspired by him, since his right eye is green and his left eye is a shade of blue like purple, the combo of blue and red. Contests. Harvey Birdman commercial. In an attempt to win a contest involving the animated avian lawyer, Chris went to great lengths to talk about himself, his rivalry with Mary Lee Walsh, and Sonichu, but very, very little about Birdman himself. He even got the character's name wrong initially and left it in on purpose. When he inevitably lost, he whined on the Adult Swim forums that his commercial was better than any of the other entries accepted. What an absolute wuss. Chop Chop Master Onion's Rap Showdown. In his reviews of the top 10 videos, Chris highly praised his entry and claimed it was the best. After losing the contest to Adam Stackhouse, Chris would have a major hissy fit over the loss, proclaiming even the slightest mistake as cheating, despite the fact that Chris himself had broken numerous rules in the process, including loading the contest with fake votes for him and bribing his stepbrother to vote for him. Even worse, he attempted to fabricate the PlayStation webpage to show that he himself had won and not Adam. GameStop Be a Star Sweepstakes. After rumors circulated that whoever won this particular contest would end up becoming a playable character in a Guitar Hero game, trolls voted for Chris's entry en masse in the hopes that he would end up appearing in World Tour. Alas, this was not the case, but Chris did end up winning at the contest anyway, which undoubtedly raised his ego. So yes, that one is absolutely the trolls' fault, if anything else. Chris claimed that he would share his prize, a $400 GameStop certificate, with his church congregation. However, he only gave $180 to his church, with the remaining money being used on himself. Just wow. And bear in mind, Chris didn't even have to do anything whatsoever to win that, and Chris couldn't have just done the right... Never mind. Others. Is it worth going into the rest of these? Because, yeah, I suppose so. Greene County School Board. In one video, Chris proclaims that the Greene County School Board, who sought to help Chris when he was younger, initiated a mass conspiracy theory against him in order to keep him in his autistic shell. This also included paying off a realtor to keep their house from being sold, and paying off Michael Snyder to keep him out of the game place. Unban contracts. Chris demands the likes of GameStop and Best Buy to unban him for his incidents over there, even though they had every right to ban him for his conduct. Not only that, but he also demands that they do not call the police against him, which is illegal since contracts cannot be used to protect from criminal prosecution. Exactly. Also, contracts are only enforceable if a contract is legally enforceable. Just saying don't call the police does not mean that deciding what other people can and cannot do in a legal matter is right or is right, thus making it null and void, which he believes that not signing would prove that they are the most uncompassionate and lacking of heart and soul of any person, and are a bunch of unwelcome and immature rat-ass bastards, I suppose. He even goes as far as to say that his ban from those places is outdated, similar to how he tried to convince Michael Snyder that he needs to forgive and forget, and that the ban is a human rights violation because he's a lesbian trans woman. Affirmations list. A 3-page long list Chris wrote in March 2021 of his positive traits. It consists of thoroughly delusional assessments for stroking his ego. His vocabulary. The whole purpose of language is to communicate thoughts and the ideas to other people, but Chris has managed to turn his vocabulary into a brick wall by crafting a mutilated lexicon that makes sense only to him, forcing people who want to communicate with him to understand his bastardized vocabulary, as opposed to Chris having to talk normally and understand regular speech. In the comic, while issue 0 and issue 1 do focus on Sonichu, that's quite shocking when you think about it, Chris Chan takes over as the main character throughout issue 2, 5, 6, and 7, with Sonichu as a supporting character. In his infrequent appearances, he invariably sings Chris's praises. Issues 8 and 9 see Sonichu take back his major role as the main character, but at this stage, he's just a Mary Sue for Chris. The main story arc of issue 10 is the resurgence of Chris and his elimination of every enemy he has so far. He also portrays himself as skinny and handsome, although this doesn't happen till said issue 2. And throughout the comic series, sporadically gives his self-insert character superpowers that are never explained. He even makes several episodes that dramatize events he had in real life, with the extremely self-indulgent fantasies that are described below. Chris's ego is in full bloom in the comics. The name of the city in which he and his electric hedgehog Pokemon strive to protect is known as Quickville. The city's currency is C quarters and W quarters. One of the major drinks in this city is known as Quick Cola. The radio station is called KCWC. The hotel is called the Double Quick. Even his Hyrule ripoff is called Rule Quick. Basically, everything is named after Chris. The Sonichus and Rosechus he created refer to him as Father. His self-insert is Mayor, but never ever performs any mayoral duties whatsoever, and his actual role is more like a god king than any kind of elected official. As Chris says, there is no elections. So it's a dictatorship then, I guess. Instances of Chris's ego in the comics. Sonichu 3. This issue has a semi-fictionalized account of an incident Chris had with the managers at a McDonald's he was loitering and soliciting at, and, knowing that a 25-year-old morbidly obese autistic man-child creepily looking at patrons can't possibly end well, security threw him out. In his comic, however, Chris exclaims that the jerk-cops are conspiring against him, preventing him from finding true love. He turns into Sonichu, Chris Chan Sonichu, and defeats them with the help of Darkbind Sonichu, who admits he only helped because Chris was his creator. Sonichu issue 5. This issue has Chris write Sarah Hammer out of the comic so he could focus exclusively on Megan Schroeder, the new object of his desire. While Sarah did marry a man named William Spicer, Chris was not present at her wedding, and had never met Spicer, as he was represented in the comic by a generic Yu-Gi-Oh character. I think it was Jax Knight, on the top of my head. The next episode has Chris fawning over Megan, and she over him. In reality, Megan saw Chris only as a friend, and was constantly rebuffing his advances. The episode features two different endings because Megan either did not like the original ending or objected to being featured in the comic at all. Sonichu issue 7. Chris is envious of Bionic's ability to screw Magagi until Megan holds his hand, again implying romance where none exists. After Chris gets trapped in the time void, he mixes both fake memories from the comic with real ones like Megan dumping him and his denial of having drawn She Came for Quick.jpg. He blames it on ED, even though he was the one who drew it and uploaded it onto that site. Mary Lee Walsh's invasion of Quickville and her defeat at the hands of Sonichus and Rosechus, and Joshua Martinez hooking him up with Vanessa Hudgens. Sonichu 12-9. The comic features a new self-insert for Chris named Nightstar, which is a blatant Mary Sue empowered with story-breaking psychic abilities. Nightstar meets with Chris's comic incarnation, who is inexplicably coloured to resemble yet another depiction of Chris, because we needed another one, and helps him transform into a body that looks like herself. The character's full names are Christine Knight Weston Star Chandler, which Chris wrote without a hint of irony whatsoever, Chris also depicts his real self in the comic as an alicorn, an extremely rare species of pony that combines the powers of a Pegasus and a unicorn, from My Little Pony reserved solely for elite characters. Sonichu 13. This issue focuses on an incoherent series of plot threads the idea guys wrote into brainwashing Chris into believing. When Louis was attacked by cloakers, Chris proceeded to send Quickville's entire army division, the Quick Defense, and his team of Autobots, led by his own Autobot car, Sonchu, to her aid. After Uzume managed to make herself whole again and asked Chris for her powers back, Chris effortlessly transferred the powers within himself back to Uzume, while still keeping Uzume's seal. Chris zapped a hotel with lightning because it was full of criminals. Their crimes are unknown, but Chris's judgment is divine, so who cares? ? When someone else had become mayor of Quickville, Chris destroyed the Quickville Mall, killing thousands and the non-mayor, showing how he is the true and honest mayor of Quickville. When Monica tried to wipe Chris's memories, it didn't work because Chris was immune. Then Quickville was clear. All the baddies were gone, and everything went back to normal because Chris said so. At some point, all 5 of the Sailor Scout souls came to Chris and spoke kind words that blessed his heart crystal, which grew his powers. Chris showcases his goddess complex by likening himself to the CPU goddesses of Hyperdimension Neptunia. When he was having a conversation with Louis at a lovely cafe, Chris broke down and cried, claiming that due to his online history, no one would hire him without taking into account that he looks like a middle-aged misanthrope playing dress-up with a toddler and smells like the dumpster he lives in. He then continues to cry, screaming that his responsibilities are near endless. When Jamster Sonichu was tried for sexual harassment, Chris obstructed the law by sending him his good vibes towards the courthouse, and the judge declared Jamster Sonichu not guilty. This sounds more like more oral, Morton logic, as opposed to anything. Even for Quickville standards, this is quite insane. When the Australasians attacked Quickville, Chris was able to regroup the Quickville forces with all his level 100 Pokemon that he had accumulated over the years. Chris created the CPU battery-charged Blue Heart to attempt to pray for the war to end. In an attempt to save Simola from burning alive, Chris projects himself and sets psychic barriers, magically withstanding the heat and agony of their flamethrowers. Chris claims that with the help of Magi-chan, he realized that all the messages from God Jesus that he had received so far had only been a can missing with his head, shifting the blame of himself acting on the impulses to God Jesus, and then to a Khan. Chris deepens his goddess complex by announcing that he no longer believes in God, but rather in the CPU goddesses that he is a part of. Chris finds all thousands of his clones and napalms them on an open field. He is also victorious in the Quickville War by making the Nazis retreat. Chris claims to be able to repair or appear in multiple places at once, not feel pain, and kill everyone he does not like with lightning speed. Moreover, anytime a Nazi misgenders him, they turn into liquid paste after being magically doused in Chris's blood, and all the Nazis not liquefied turn into Sonichus. 7 Chris Chan Sonichu statues are erected in Quickville, reminding its citizens of who they have no choice but to worship. Sonichu issue 14. This is still ongoing, by the way. Boy, Quickville really was like the power fantasy of all time, wasn't it? Chris begins the issue by describing his great destiny and why he is a unique Sonichu. Sonichu conveys to the reader that Chris has always had special abilities, that his future is predetermined, and how he goes above and beyond to keep him safe. Chris claims that he even personally helped to save numerous days in a superheroic manner. Chris recounts how he utilized the Reality Stone to undo all the harm the idea guys caused to C-197 Dimension, before punishing them. Chris reminds us that significant occurrences are all connected to him and that he serves as one of the main deity conduits for the merge. Chris claims that his soul and thoughts are somehow projected everywhere and that the heavy energy coming from the heart aura makes his numb body totally functioning. Chris makes an effort to categorize his uncontrollable, loud, long, thunderous belches as a drawback of being a goddess, and not his poor diet. Chris asserts that his psychic abilities outstand a doctor. Chris displays his sense of self-importance by claiming that when he was unable to lucid dream, Emmanuel, Jesus, Buddha, the CPU goddesses, and all other deities interviewed in his dreams and attempted to assist him by reminding him of his goddess powers and how to use them. Chris rambles on, much like this page, and asserting that he literally shares a subspace and subdimension with all of the other deities in the galaxy with his subconscious. Chris asserts that he sang and danced in tandem with the actors on stage during the Bronia Con Grand Galloping Gala without any prior experience or training. He draws a scene showing that he captivated a few attendants behind him who were surprised by his skills. Chris attributes these events to his magical powers rather than by his ego playing tricks on him. Because Chris is absolutely fucking insane, that's probably why. And with that cleared up, that is it. That is the whole of Chris and his ego, his narcissism, the whole shebang. And as I mentioned, well, I didn't mention this before, but I have mentioned this in several other instances because this has been going on long and just shy of too long. Chris is the bona fide example of a 4-year-old child trapped in a 43-year-old man's body. So, yeah. Thank all of you guys so much for being with me throughout this, and should I split this up into 2 parts? Well, we'll wait and see. But I hope all of you guys had nothing better to do with your evening than listen to me. Thank you, and I'll see all of you guys again next time. Take care, and bye-bye for now.